if there's a conflict of interest, please bring that forward at that time. Before I introduce our consultant who will be speaking to our official plan, I have set some guidelines. I did a lot of thinking about the best way to tackle this document. I don't want to, and I'm sure you will agree with me, because of the importance of it, we don't want to gloss over it. So I've set a guidelines and format to get through the document. As you are all aware, it's large and it's very detailed, but we need the opportunity as councillors to drill down into the various sections, the challenges and concerns. If you refer to the back page, which is next steps, of which our consultant will address, we are to provide direction and recommendations on this report. So if we could divide the document into 3 sections with a question period between each, that way we can drill down to the various sections. If you could restrict your questions to the area or content that has just been covered, rather than moving forward into the next section. Each councillor will be allowed a maximum of 3 questions, and that's not going to be the limit. In other words, we will start with our deputy mayor and we'll go across the room and you can ask your 3 questions. And if there are still additional questions, we can start at the left-hand side of our chamber and come right back through to the right. If you do not have any questions, and this is not to put any of our councillors on the spot, just pass, because maybe your questions that you have prepared for today, which I'm sure we all have been already answered by our consultant, or maybe a previous councillor has already asked those questions. So don't be afraid to say pass. So how will we divide the document? The first section includes the preamble, the various steps and findings from the different stakeholders, up to and including the methodology. So that's the first section. And so we will have our consultant talk to that. Then we will have our questions, our question period. The second section is from 1 to 7. And now we're really getting, I call them, into the meat and potatoes of the document, where there's very specifics that are identified. And as you are aware, and I know our councillors are aware of this, but those that are on, maybe who have not had the opportunity to look at the document or are online, this section is divided into 4 columns. There's the provincial policy statement, Lanark County Sustainable Community Official Plan, and it's very, as members, our mayor and our deputy mayor who sit on Lanark County Council, they know and can contest that these are very critical and that we meet these requirements. And then the third section has to do with our present official plan. And then it moves into the revisions and recommendations from our consultant. This will be followed by a question period. And finally, the last section, which we do not want to gloss over, are all the important comments that we have received in writing from people who have taken their time and energy to engage in our official plan. And we will have our consultant talk to this. There will be our last question period, and then we will wrap up this with our next steps. So, with no further ado, I would like to introduce to you Forbes Simon, consultant from JP2G Consulting Incorporated, Preliminary Planning Issues and Policy Options Report, the Official Plan and Review and Update. And if you can, Forbes, take us forward into and including the methodology in your first presentation, we would be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. First off, it's a pleasure being with you this afternoon. It always is a pleasure to be in this council chamber. And I want to thank you as a council and staff for taking the time and effort. This is a critical component, critical time in the update of your official plan. The report that you have before you is the culmination of phase one of the project. It's a two-phase project. The first is the official plan review component. What elements of the official plan are thought of as needing improvement, update, clarification, elimination, whatever that may be. The second part, phase two, is the actual updating exercise where you'll be presented with detailed policy options and wording that you can debate and wordsmith, and that we will work together on to come up with a document that at the end of the day, you adopt, it gets approved by Lanark County Council, and you've got a new modern version of your official plan. So this is the culmination of the review. And the entire project was intended to ensure that your document is current, reflects current provincial policies, reflects the current policies in the Lanark County official plan, reflects the current social context of the community and what is important to the community going forward for the next 5-year period. This exercise can be relatively complicated, relatively heavy in terms of planning policy, that certainly excites me, but doesn't always excite others around me. And I appreciate that. I do try to present things in common language. And I do want to, before I get into the details here, commend council and your staff and the public for participating. I've done this many times now, and you don't always get the response that I got on this project, both at the council level, your thoughtful comments during the questionnaire period, your staff, and certainly from the public, we received many, many thoughtful comments. In terms of the process, I'm not going to get into too much details, but we did circulate to a sort of a notice of commencement to agencies saying we were doing this, and if they wanted to participate, to give us some ideas of themes and topics they felt were important. We also held a special council meeting back in June of last year, where it functions as a notice of commencement to the public that, listen, we're doing this review. Please give us your comments. Please pay attention to this important project. And we did receive comments until the end of July, but it's also, I think, something for council to be aware that as people gave thought to the project after that July period and took the time and effort to put in comments, both your director and myself agreed that they would be part of the record going forward and that we wouldn't use some artificial date as a cutoff. We're very early in the process. Any and all input should be valued and respected. We also established a component on your website where there was a depository of information and people could submit comments. And I think that the start of the project was very successful, at least from my perspective. We did receive a few comments from agencies. It's not uncommon at this stage in the game for agencies to go, thanks very much, and they file it. And it's not until we get to draft written comment or suggestions that they will actually go, oh, I think you should think about this or that. There are two groups in particular that have provided comments that I think are important, and that's from MTO, which is a major influence in this community and how we design and grow, as well as from the health unit. And over the last decade, health units across the province have taken an opportunity to engage in land use planning decisions, and particularly at the policy development stage, and provide very thoughtful suggestions in how we can design and plan our communities so that we have healthier communities at the end of the day. We also had comments from the Ministry of the Mines. But unlike your neighbors around you, the rural municipalities, aggregate isn't the biggest issue that you're dealing with. And but I want to say, just for the record, that the Ministry of Mines is perhaps the most responsive government agency that I deal with on a day-to-day basis in this projects, but they don't have a lot to say about the town of Perth and aggregate or bedrock. One of the components I truly enjoy doing with the review component is the survey of staff and council. And sometimes the process that you go through and thinking about things is quite often more valuable than the content that you get back. I think I've found that in the past, the survey stimulates thought, stimulates discussion, and start looking at the community in a little bit more critical way and how we can be better. And that's the idea, isn't it? That we take where we are today and we look forward and plan to be better in the future. I think in general, the thoughts and comments that came back showed a high level of engagement and appreciation of what land use planning is and what the role of the official plan is, in terms of it being a guiding document or a big picture document. And I think that there was also an appreciation for the distinction between the official plan, which is policy and forward thinking, versus the zoning bylaw, which is more regulatory and day-to-day, and something that more people get exposed to on a personal basis. I think that the idea of how the official plan affects you as individuals and as council was well thought out. I think that people realize that it's about managing change, whether it's change in my own neighborhood or change on a broader community basis. It's about managing change, and it's about giving direction to the zoning bylaw to get that where the weeds are, say, so to speak. And so I think that there is a keen understanding of what this document does and how important it is to the community. In terms of going forward and the future development, I think that there's a general consensus of a desire to see our housing crisis dealt with on a local basis. The need for affordable housing, the need for diversity in our housing, that there is a direct correlation between those that live here and shopping and schools and recreation, and the need to have a very integrated, comprehensive view of growth and development. It's just not one side of the ledger. It's not just private investment. There's also a need for public investment for it to all come together. I think that there's some very specific elements that were highlighted, various green initiatives, planting of trees, more walkable community, more pedestrian-oriented community. I think those are strong themes that came through. I also think that there was very heightened awareness of the importance of infill and intensification with existing neighborhoods and the need to get that right. It's one thing to plan out streets and lots and parks on a greenfield area where there's nothing existing. It's a completely different issue in terms of the complexity of integrating new into established neighborhoods. And it seems to be that the latter part of my career, that's been the primary focus and the primary area of challenge in land use planning, is getting that right. And there are many examples in communities that have done that well, both large urban areas, but also smaller sort of peer-like contemporary communities within our general area. I think that there's other issues looking at business and industry and the need to be attractive for that type of investment. Jobs and the taxation that comes from commercial industrial is always important. I think we've also had a clear sense in terms of our existing development and what we've experienced over the last decade or 2 decades as a community and where we need to do better. It's very clear in Perth and beyond, I think, that the golf course development has captured the attention of the community. And whether you're pro or con or somewhere in between, it is a development that has the potential to change the community. The same as other greenfield areas have changed the community over the last 3 or 4 decades. One of the things I stated at the special council meeting, and I think that it's important for council to appreciate, is that we cannot make policy on the back of an application. We can't have policy come along that applies retroactively to a development application that's in the door. That being said, I have been challenged by one of your local residents who's participated in this process and that I know is very, very passionate about the community, Mr. Tennant. And he has said, yes, you're absolutely right. We can't make an policy on the back of an application, but we can learn and we can set it up so that the policy isn't retroactive, but deals with the next round. And I think I always pay attention to what Mr. Tennant says, and I thought those were very good words. In terms of the future and where we're going, I think, again, it's about greening of the community. I think people see both the positive and negative of growth. I think more traffic, more taxation, more support for community amenities. There's our green spaces and our pathways. And I think that the takeaway was the idea that change does come and it has 2 sides of the coin. I think that people look at it as an attractive place to live and work. And there were a few areas that were identified specifically for policy change that we'll get into later on. Climate change is certainly an area that we have to focus on. And you are a well-rounded community. You have an economy in Perth. It's a regional service center, and continuing that going forward and making sure we take advantage of the opportunities are key. And then the final component is protecting our waterways and natural areas, which is a major theme of both the provincial and county plans, as well as your own plan today. As I've said, we did a critical review of your official plan against the county plan and the provincial policy statements. We've given thought to the comments that have been provided by the public and the interview questions, and the agencies as well. And that's what the next component will be. But I think we've done enough talking on the first part for a moment. Sure.
Thank you very much. So at this point in time, our consultant has taken us right up to the section on the framework that was used to devise the official plan. And so what we will do now is we will start with questions, and I think we'll start right over here with our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Ed McPherson. You're okay? All right. Councillor Bolt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Forbes, you were speaking about infill and intensification, getting it right. Couldn't agree with you more, but the part that frustrates me as a councillor is that we are constantly, and it's more around the zoning application. We're constantly having people wanting to change zoning to accomplish what they want, not what's necessarily best for the community in some cases. And when you say getting it right, we're talking about, you know, the future and developing new subdivisions and so on. At what point do we say the zoning is this, and this is why the zoning is this, and that's where it's going to stay? So that if I'm going to buy a home in a certain subdivision, and there's many examples of this happening right now, and based on the, let's say it's an R1 zoning, and based on that, I've been told by my lawyer that, you know, I don't have to worry about a 4-story building going up on a lot behind me, or a shopping mall or whatever. To get it right, how do we protect the people that buy something in an R1 zoning and then suddenly find out that there's been a zoning application to change it from R1 to R3 or whatever? Or is there any way we, or is it, we can't stop that? I'd like your comment on that, please.
Councillor, thank you very much. That's a big question. I have a tendency to give long-winded answers, but I'll try to be brief with that one, just to move it forward. I think that in this day and age, the way planning is done in communities, we're all being challenged on traditional planning standards. The whole concept of R1 zone is being radically altered across the country and North America. And I've often been heard saying that zoning and our vision of ideal that's in zoning should not be a barrier to good ideas and good design and thoughtful change within a neighborhood. And I think, thank you very much. I think the idea that zoning is static is something that it is no longer the case. I do know certain communities where they approach zoning as static, and it gets them into trouble. I think that what we need is policies that give us direction and guidance how to fit new into old. We need policies and zoning that reflect that change is inevitable, there's nobody that should be moving into a neighborhood in this day and age thinking that everything is going to stay static and it's not going to change. That's just not realistic anymore. And particularly as communities become attractive for new growth and development, you will see more and more intensification requests. I had a tremendous amount of experience in Kempville in the early 2000s. And that was a community where not a lot was going on. And all of a sudden, a regional group came in, built a golf course and 1,000 houses. What happens is that smaller scale developers start looking for investment opportunities. And it is on individual properties in individual neighborhoods, and they bring in infill and intensification. It is inevitable as you grow that you will have pressures on your neighborhood. And we just need to put together a toolkit so that you can manage the change, so that you can have some influence on the change, but you're not going to stop the change.
Okay. Councillor Bolt, you have an additional?
Anything.
Okay, we'll pass. Okay, Your Worship, Mayor Judy Brown. Go
I have
ahead.
3 questions.
Go ahead.
The first is, let's see. It's on page 7. There will be a need to annex more land because the current vacant lands will be developed. And I know you said somewhere else in the report, about boundary adjustment should be easier. So I wondered if you could elaborate how that might come about, because Perth simply does not have the 15 or 20% of vacant land available for the future.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think that we get into that a bit more in the next phase, Mayor, but I think that every community should be thinking beyond the next 5-10 years. And where are we going to go when this amount of land has been used up? The last lands that were brought into the town were brought in almost 15 years ago now. It took 10 years to plan for those, to do the studies, to figure out transportation, to figure out how we're going to service. And it was only in 2018 that you redesignated those annexed lands. It takes a long time to do it. And I think what the policies are saying is that you need to think longer term. You need to plan because it takes a lot of time to bring those lands in. And there's limited opportunities around Perth, right? You're surrounded on 2 sides by wetlands, 1 side by lagoon and landfill. And really it's to the southwest that you have some opportunities. And so thinking about that and planning for that, I think is always something an official plan should be speaking to.
Okay. Yeah.
Go ahead, Judy, with your second question.
Need to find it first. Oh, a desire to work with developers to achieve mutually beneficial growth. Yeah, that's a nice ideal. People are pretty scared about the golf course lands coming in, and they've looked at the development, a similar development in Richmond, and small lots, et cetera, et cetera. In your experience, has there been a lot of success in negotiating with the developer to alter their plans?
I think we have to try. I think we have to make efforts. I think we have to appreciate that someone is looking at my community to make an investment in. And you need to look at them as in sort of a client type of way. Sometimes your clients aren't very receptive to ideas. Other times your clients are very receptive to ideas. Sometimes you can have a significant amount of influence on change in your community.
Mhm.
Other times, you can be wasting your breath. I think, though, as a matter of public policy, you should always be seen as a constructive player at the table in terms of growth and development and change in your community.
Okay.
And it's two sides of the ledger.
Okay, so my last question is about, you mentioned about, keeping the water supply viable and so on. And there have been some people over the years that have said that we need to have something supplementary, on top of the river being available. Particularly, we've got some reasonably substantial developments coming down the pike. Just wondered what you thought about the idea of drilling a municipal well.
As a land use planner, I'm not going to sit here and tell your director of public works how to do his job. I think that you're in probably the most competent hands with him. But I think that, and I heard the comments, Mayor, that there is a need for an alternative water source, that we have a surface water supply system that could be perceived as being vulnerable. I don't disagree with that, but there's a reason that the town of Perth has a surface water supply, right? That the aquifer is not as ideal as you would like it to be. You don't have the Nepean aquifer right underneath you like the town of Kemptville has, right? So I think, again, an aspirational policy is always to minimize any vulnerability you have. And I would not argue that having a single surface water supply of a relatively mid-sized river is not ideal, and that it's always worthwhile seeing if there's some way to have some redundancy in that system and to improve that system so that it's less vulnerable.
Thank you for your report, by the way. It's extensive and it's very helpful.
Thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you. So we will go on to Councillor Barry Smith. If you have questions.
I didn't think we were at the water point of this conversation, but seeing it was brought up, the question I had, and I'm going to quote what you wrote in point 17 under studio and master plans, explore opportunities for improved and additional water access points through improvement to municipally owned lands. And my thoughts were, with one source where it is downstream from development, we might be well off in looking for alternate sources.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I think that point 17 is, I would like to take credit for those words, but they aren't mine. They come from the Recreation Master Plan. And it was identified early on with staff that we should not lose the recommendations of the master plan. So I went through and I mined it for land use planning related recommendations. There's a lot of operational recommendations, but there were elements of it that relate to that. I think it is a cherished resource for communities that have water to provide public access to it. I often think it's a crime that you have a community that has water and it's taken up by private development. And so I think anytime that you have an opportunity to improve access to your water resources, is a good thing. So, but that point 17, I think, again, I'd like to take credit, but they're not my words. But thank you. You're welcome.
Any other questions, Counselor?
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to Counselor Waterfield.
Thank you very much, Chair. Two questions through you to Forbes. On the bottom of page 4, it states there are no policies or regulations regarding the short-term rentals and their potential impact on the housing supply. Have you seen a trend in municipalities in terms of regulations in this area? And do you recommend that that's something we should look at in terms of updating our official plan?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes. It's a hot topic. It's certainly a hot topic in rural communities that have sort of cottage country, right? Lanark Highlands to the north, Drummond North Elmsley to the south, Tay Valley to the west. You get up into the Algonquin area. It's pretty much the #1 issue. Over into North Kawartha, it's a hot topic. And it certainly, in a small town environment, is emerging as a critical issue in terms of the supply of affordable rental accommodation. There have been some studies that have suggested somewhere between 16 and 30% of available rental accommodations in sort of tourist towns are being taken up by short-term rentals. From an official plan policy standpoint, most communities I'm working with now are putting in guiding policies. It's not too much more, Counselor, than a paragraph or two. The real implementation is through zoning and also municipal act bylaws, licensing bylaws under the municipal act. And so most communities now that are serious about regulating short-term rentals are doing a combination of a licensing bylaw and zoning. And so what the official plan does is sort of paints a path to that, talks about it in very general, talks about topics or subjects that could be looked at or vetted in a bylaw, but not too much more than just a paragraph. But it is a significant issue these days.
Thank you very much. My second question, looking at page 6 toward the end of section 3, there's a paragraph on the whole area of the fairgrounds. And I'll just make one quote. The suggestion was that if not all of the fairgrounds, then at least some of the Prime Street footage be redeveloped for affordable housing. The question of the fairgrounds in this town has come up time and again in past years. My question to you, in your experience with other municipalities that may have had towns grow up around fairgrounds in more central areas, what has been the trend in terms of municipal governments speaking with the owners of fairgrounds and having discussions about potential changes to that land?
Yeah, that's a hard one, Counselor. Fair boards are an entity on their own under the Municipal Act. I think they have their own legislation. They have certainly rights and privileges that other landholders don't have. I believe this is the second location for the Fair Board historically. I think Grant is saying it's the 4th location, and he was the president of the Fair Board, so I will defer to him. But it's not uncommon for communities to grow up and around significant green space holdings. This is a purpose-built green space holding that's not in public ownership, which challenges all of us. And I do have firsthand knowledge of the challenges associated with this. Again, I think it's a question of what was coming back to me through the interviews is we need to have a conversation. We need to sit down and talk about this and get a clear idea and identify the problems, identify the barriers, and start working at solving it. Right. And that was the sense I got from the interview, that it's an opportunity. It's an amazing resource, and maybe there's something we can do to utilize that land a little differently than what it's been done historically. But it's certainly a common element that large green holdings that have been growing up around get looked at for development purposes. It's not always a positive, but it's something you should discuss.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Bird.
Thank you through the chair. Most of my colleagues have covered areas, so I'd like to just piggyback on a few of theirs for my second and third question. But for the first one, and I think all my questions are going to be ones that you'll say possibly you're not in a position to answer.
Excuse me, I hate to interject, Councillor Bird. Can you speak into your mic so
Yeah,
then we
move it a
can hear
bit
you?
closer.
Thank you.
All my questions may be ones that you cannot answer specifically, but I'll ask them nonetheless. Overall, and you've been talking an overall opening to this. Would it be fair to say that no matter what we're looking at, whether it's density, develop road structure, would it come down to a question for the community as to whether it wants to look and feel and operate like a rural municipality as opposed to suburbia?
Hmm.
I think you're a small town. And small towns have a tendency to grow with appendages, right? The green fields are around you. When you annex lands, it's around you. And so you grow with appendages. I think the question about the type of growth that happens is challenging. We are inundated with examples of the Kingstons and the Markhams and the larger urban areas where they're talking about growth that has 1,000 households as opposed to growth that has 100 households. And it's not always realistic in a small town environment to have anything more than a residential appendage. Typically, growth in small towns, I think, is broken into business and residential, industrial, commercial, and how are you going to grow that sector, and residential. And from a land use planning standpoint, we've historically segregated those uses because they can have conflict. So when we talk about growth and the idea that it looks like suburbia, it is, right? Because that's what you need. That's what the market says we have to have residential. And the idea of introducing other land uses to get more of a mix, I think, is a challenge based on scale, right? If we were planning a neighborhood in Kingston, we would be thinking more about mix of land uses and commercial and school sites and places of worship and things like that, where at our scale, we really, there isn't the demand for that, right? And that what we need to do with greenfield and small town environments is not have them isolated, not have them looking away from the community, but having them integrated into the community so that they can support the existing commercial, institutional, and components of the community. And I think that is an art. I think there are some good examples of communities that have worked really, really hard at that. But I think that would be my answer to your question, Counselor.
No, that, I find that helpful. Thank you. My second one would be in relation to zoning, so kind of related. I'm impressed that you're advocating balance and how we have to be very careful how we structure things. So in relation to zoning, would it be fair to say that if we're not careful in how we structure the official plan and therefore the zoning that comes out of it, we might restrict our ability to look at individual developments case by case, and perhaps on occasion as a council say, no, on this occasion, we're not going to change the zoning from R1 to R4.
First off, I would like to move away from R1 because I don't think R1 exists in the province of Ontario anymore, right? It is as a right across the board in the province of Ontario that we can have 3 units on a residential property, right? We do not have R1 zoning anymore, right? So I'd like to rephrase that and say maybe from R2 to R4.
I'm happy to get the answer.
I think zoning is a very different beast. I do know that historically, council, a number of councils ago, made the policy decision to identify R4 lands that were vacant and say, this is where we want our apartments. That was a pretty progressive move, and it bore some fruit for the community. But it also eliminates the ability to influence that change. And so I think that the official plan needs to talk about mix. It needs to talk about opportunities, but the details get reflected in the zoning, and that's a future part of the scope of work. And quite often, councillor is the most challenging part, right? It's one thing to establish aspirational policies. It's another thing to reflect it in a 2-dimensional document like a zoning bylaw, and it's a challenge.
Yes,
But I think
my concern is flexibility.
and the flexibility or the lack thereof in zoning becomes an art that is typically reflective of the council of the day and what they feel is important and how they want to approach growth and how much they want to be involved with influencing growth.
Thank you. And the last one, again, sort of hits on zoning, and hopefully I'm so succinct in this, is short-term rentals as raised by Councillor Waterfield. Our businesses, especially when you can go onto any website and find that they're operating the bulk of the year. Do they have to be zoned commercial to be taxed at a business rate? The hotels don't get away with it. The motels don't get away with it.
That's a extremely good question. In an urban context, it would be hard to distinguish between yourself renting out a basement flat on a month-by-month lease basis or renting it out on a weekend nightly basis. That's a challenge. And a lot of the policies right now are making a distinction between rental within a permanent place of residence, rental within a seasonal place of residence, and rental in a property that was purchased simply to rent and be commerce. I do know that I had a discussion with senior staff at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs about this very topic on with another one of my municipalities, and they suggested that if it's a waterfront property and it's being rented out, it's a tourist cabin and should be treated as a tourist cabin commercial use, and it needs to be zoned commercial. I've taken a look at how they're dealing with this in communities like Huntsville or in Prince Edward County. And I think zoning, the sense I'm getting is zoning is a pretty blunt instrument for dealing with short-term rentals. And that it's better to use a regulatory licensing approach through a municipal act bylaws. I'm finding is sort of the trend that people are following. But there can be some zoning implications based on whether it's an owner occupied use versus simply something that was bought purely for commercial uses. But again, it's sort of a blunt instrument in that.
Thank you.
respect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask some questions, if I may, as a chair. You've already alluded to, and it's on the radar, situations such as Airbnbs, and the situation, of course, that happened in Picton, Ontario, where in fact, a lot of seniors had moved out of their homes, had moved into long-term care, or had moved into apartment situations, and those homes were just bought up left, right, and center by investors and then turned into Airbnbs. And then the complications that created for that community were horrendous. But as it's already been brought up, it's on the radar, and we'll have to move forward with rezoning, licensing, and our municipal act in regards to that. So I won't belabor that. I'd like to talk about the questions, Forbes, about methodology. And my question is, was there engagement by school communities in this process?
No. There was a notice of commencement that was sent to the school boards. All four, the French Catholic, French Public, English Catholic, English Public, as a notice of commencement. I can tell you as a matter of record that school boards typically do not engage in community official plan discussions. That is sometimes unfortunate. But I think that doesn't mean that there isn't the ability to engage the school board outside of this process, particularly in terms of future school sites. And I think that those discussions may or may not be ongoing. But school boards don't often get involved. If they do, I think it's great because they have fairly sophisticated population projection modeling that can be helpful. And they have a critical component of what I call a complete community in terms of the schools. And without the schools, a community can suffer.
I think Joanna would like to speak to this as well. Yeah.
Sorry, just really briefly, I have spoken to schools, not specifically about this, but I did let them know that this process was going on. And we've had chats back and forth about sort of developments that may be happening so that they're aware. I made a point in my previous positions to always keep in contact with schools. They're not always open to talk or be concerned about it, but in some cases they are. And so I have been in contact with a couple of school boards just to let them know this process is going on and have sort of general discussions with them.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that they were involved. The majority of my questions, Forbes, are in the next section.
Thank you.
I have lots of questions in that. I just wanted to bring one other subject matter forward. And I just want to caution us all with the Ontario Land Tribunal processes going forward. We need to speak generically in regards to those specific developments. So I'm just bringing that to the forefront so that we're all cautioned, because in many of the instances and examples given, it does make mention of those developments. So we need to be careful. Okay, so we will then move forward. Forbes, if we can go to the second section, and everybody can turn to that in their documents from 1 to 17. And as I said, now we're really getting into the specifics of the document. And I'll let you take that away, Forbes.
Thank you very much. What I'm thinking, just to get us through this and get to the question part of it, I'm going to more or less just highlight a couple of critical elements that are more related to the PPS and the need for change to be compliant. And the first one is engaging Indigenous communities and reflecting about Indigenous communities in our official plan. You have retained the services of a consultant. I've worked with that consultant in the past. We have had a number of meetings on this project. I've got a very clear idea of how Chief Lalonde could see improvements to your plan so that they reflect traditional Indigenous values. And I think that they're threefold. One would be where we go on quite eloquently about the history of colonial occupation of the town of Perth. We should have something similar about pre-colonial occupation. And Chief Lalonde and I have worked on wording in other communities that we would sort of borrow from. They're similar, but it basically tells how the lands were occupied pre-1800. We should also have very, very clear policies on when archaeological assessments are triggered, and what happens when pre-colonial discoveries are made. And there is a protocol that the Algonquins of Ontario have developed. There's a protocol that has come out of Curve Lake in the Peterborough area that are all very consistent with how we deal with this. And essentially, archaeological assessments are 4 stages. And if you get to stage 3, it means that you have First Nation representatives on site. The other sort of value area that has come out of my discussions with Chief Lalonde is related to the natural heritage system and your water systems. That is fundamental. And so there will be, I think, a need to speak about engagement and how we communicate with our First Nation communities with respect to natural heritage. Climate change is another big theme in the PPS that needs to be picked up on. I think Perth has been a leader in the Lanark County sense in terms of preparing a climate action plan. I think reference to your climate action plan as an operational document, I think has some value. But I think that there are a number of key areas that you need to make policy change about the location of vulnerable public and institutional services as well as residential services, primarily related to floodplain risks, the need to plan for infrastructure to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. You also are very progressive in how you deal with stormwater management. how you've been minimizing infiltration into your sanitary system. Those are all the types of practices that need to continue and perhaps be highlighted going forward. And then energy efficiencies are key component. We spoke about growth management. The town, through official plan amendment number 16, did, I think, a pretty good job in terms of planning for growth. It hasn't always been adhered to, but I think that we did a good job as a community planning for growth. And I also think that was done in 2018. It was prior to the current census population estimates for the community. And it's also worth noting that Lanark County is going through a population analysis right now. I think, and my recommendation here is that as part of this official plan update, you should, as a minimum, review the assumptions of the 2018 comprehensive review that you undertook that was part of official plan amendment 16, and potentially update and provide an update to your comprehensive review. I really think that that is perhaps one of the biggest and most important recommendations, is to do that, and for you to commit to doing that as part of this process. The PPS talks about official plan updates as the time that you should consider doing them. And I think under the circumstances, it would be a valuable exercise for the community to go through. Perth has a fantastic commercial industrial base. I think you're the envy of many communities your size. But I think that there's also the ability to look at policies that encourage being investment ready. Property, or that you've got reserve capacity in your infrastructure, that you've got robust telecommunication infrastructure, all of which are sort of modern planning concepts that come out of economic development. I think that you could pick up on. And I also think that a big part of the economic success of Perth is progressive heritage policies. And there were a number of changes that have happened through the various bills that have been passed by the provincial government in the last 5 years related to heritage. And I think that your policies as a minimum should respect the changes that have happened to the Heritage Act. The final component, I think, is that your plan would benefit from a bit of an improvement in terms of land use compatibility and the friction points that exist in a community like Perth between industrial and residential, industrial and sensitive land uses. And I've highlighted that as well. The other thing is that you've got home occupation policies that are in 2 areas of the plan. I think they should come into one. And I also think that sometimes your policy is too detailed and should be more flexible in an official plan. And then the detail is reflected in the zoning bylaw, which is a much easier document to modify and tweak. You don't want to have a situation where a home occupation that makes sense to everybody around the table is running into an official plan barrier. It's better that there be a zoning barrier. It's much easier to manage. And so I think taking some of the concepts and being less prescribed in the official plan may benefit you in the long run. I spoke about land use compatibility. already. I think that that is a policy area that could have some improvements. Section 6 deals specifically with housing and intensification. I think that you've got very good targets right now for low, medium, and high density and mixing within the community. I think that it's always beneficial to look at those targets and say, yes, we still agree with them, or no, they could be slightly modified. I also strongly believe that there should be a distinction between greenfield density targets and infill and intensification density targets and how we deal with that. I think you could benefit from policies related to additional residential units. You've got secondary dwelling units. I think that's now sort of fallen by the wayside. And I also think that your general policies on infill and intensification should be vetted and detailed, and maybe approaches by other communities that I think are having some success with the integration of new and old would be beneficial to look at. Your policies regarding parks and open space, I think, are great. I think some more specific reference to the Tay River would be helpful. I think the Daru Farm is a new component to your recreation base that could benefit from being looked at and mentioned in the official plan. Your sewer and water policies, I think, are quite good, but as mentioned, there may be some benefit in tightening them up in terms of resiliency to climate change. The stormwater policies could look at contamination load and risk management. That may be helpful. And also, if you do a comprehensive review as recommended, your sewer and water capacity become critical components of that. And looking seriously at the fourth cell on the Sagar system to accommodate future growth. Transportation is pretty straightforward, though I think that you could have some additional work in looking at corridors and utility and transportation corridors being more integrated in your plan. They're somewhat disjointed now. And I also think that you need to give some thought to alternative design considerations. When you are approached by today's developer, they will be pushing your standards, right? Whether it's road widths or sewer and water depths or size of lines. And I think that consideration of alternative standards is just part of being prepared for future growth. Natural heritage, I think, is an important component going forward. There is a requirement for you to have a natural heritage system plan with this official plan. That is a new requirement under the province. You've got all the pieces, but it needs to be brought in together into one sort of schedule. And I think that that is important. I also think that you need to deal with floodplain in a much more upfront way. You've got floodplain that's recognized in the community, but in some respects, it's almost as if it doesn't exist in other ways. And so I think that you need to touch on some of that as well. Cultural heritage, I mentioned about archaeological assessments. I mentioned about changes to the Heritage Act. Those need to be picked up. Again, I mentioned about floodplain. Public service facilities, I think, again, they need to be resilient to climate change. Council, one of the things that I failed to include in this report were the comments that came from your fire chief. I've been communicating back and forth with Trevor, and he has provided me some very thoughtful suggestions in terms of multiple access points to growth areas, planning for emergency situations. I will forward those to you under separate email. They did not get reflected in this report. I would like council's discretion to include them in the final version of this report. But I will send them to you, and I think that his insight is extremely important as we plan for the future. Emergency management has to be reflected. I've done a number of, there's administrative changes that I'm not going to get into. A lot of them coming out of changes to the Planning Act over the last 4 years. The definition should be updated. I've picked up the key recommendations of the Recreation Master Plan that should be given some thought to, and that's specifically related to recreation and open space, and design standards for future parks. The MTO comments are very specific, and they are prescribed. The health unit comments, I think that they've made some really good suggestions. Some of them are hard to implement, but I also think that we need to make efforts to respect their thoughtful suggestions. And many of them are picked up in other areas of the plan, but that there could be some improvements. Chair, I think that brings us to the end of that.
Thank you very much. Yes, that brings us to 17 and beyond. Maybe what we will do now is we'll start over at this side with Councillor Byrd. If you have any questions in regards to 1 to 17 in the report.
Thank you, Chair. I think everybody will relieved that I only have one. Climate change and in particular mitigation and has come up in a number of areas. It's linked like so many things are, right? It's not just a column on its own.
Mhm.
In relation to that, we already work on a we have to consider climate change mitigation as part of asset management, et cetera, et cetera. Will they work in conjunction with one another so that we don't end up in another situation where we potentially contradict ourselves over the same issue?
That's a great point. I think that the policies should be general enough to be able to be interpreted when you get to the operational side of things like asset management. I think the general concept of the PPS and what is being suggested here is that, number one, you think about climate change, and number two, you plan for resiliency. And so I think it'll be when we get to the actual text writing and it gets vetted and reviewed by staff and yourselves, excuse me, and as I design them, that we be thoughtful of the operational side.
Thank you. It's just me again being nervous about channeling ourselves.
Yeah.
Into.
I think that we need to be able to go from the general to the specific, from the policy to the operation without hiccups, without barriers, that it should be a relatively smooth transition from general to specific.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead with Councillor Waterfield then.
Madam Chair, through to Forbes, on page 13, Forbes, item number 2. And I quote, council may wish to revisit the housing density targets for low, medium, and high density development to ensure they reflect current trends and council's vision for the future. You touched a bit on that in your presentation, but I just think this is such a critical area. And without being specific about any particular development, could you just expand a bit on that? reflecting your recent experience in terms of similarly sized municipalities?
Thank you very much. Densities are, in an official plan, are a general sort of rule of thumb. This is what we're trying to achieve. They should not be interpreted to be barriers, again, to good design and thoughtful development. But generally stated. I think sometimes when we have numbers in policy, they get used as hard and fast. I also know that in every community that's facing growth pressures, we are attempting to put more density on smaller and smaller properties. And that during the last 3 decades, minimum lot frontages and minimum lot areas and minimum areas per unit have continually got smaller and smaller and smaller. I think the point of the policy is simply to look at them, to make sure that they're current, that they're reflecting the types of developments that you're approving today, and that they ultimately end up with the community that you envision Perth to be. So I think it's simply saying we need to look at them because it's a building block of development. I also believe that a lot of the time it comes down to the mix quite often of development types is often more important than the density itself. And I'm going to be relatively specific in my example. Too much of one form of residential development is not good, whether it's too much singles, too much apartments, particularly too much townhouse development. If you have too much of one form, you create issues. Too much townhouse development or whole neighborhoods of townhouse development result in parking issues. Too much of residential develop or apartment buildings results in traffic issues. Too much of single detached results in a waste of land, valuable service land. And so I think that the secret is more the mix and encouraging integrations of different densities into a neighborhood so that we get a mix of housing opportunities. I've got one community right now and they're a little freaked out about the fact that 35% of the houses in an established neighborhood are up for sale. And they're going, what's going on? What did we do? Well, it's pure demographics. It was a subdivision that was developed of all single detached houses in 1990. And everybody that moved in there was relatively the same age. The school that supported the neighborhood has got fewer kids in it. And people are moving out of that to go to smaller houses or to apartments because they've got to that stage in their life. If you have more of a mix, you're more resilient to those types of changes and that the neighborhood is much more dynamic. So again, I think wording about how density is used, promoting mix as the dominant variable over density, I think are things that are worth looking at and thinking about. Does that answer it?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a supplementary, Madam
Go
Chair.
ahead.
I would agree with you that mix is very important, and I think we could look at mix in a number of different ways. Number one is the mixture of different physical styles of housing, single family, condo, townhouse, and so forth. The second aspect of mix I think is very important is price point. The third is also encouraging different lifestyles to have a diverse community, i.e. cooperatives and so forth. Looking at those three aspects of mix, do you think those three aspects have a place in terms of our official plan?
I think right now you can interpret your official plan to say, yes, they can be accommodated. I would add into that, Councillor, tenure, ownership versus rental as well.
I would agree. Mhm.
I think that your policies are not way out of whack, right? It's just a question of where you put an exclamation mark on some, or the wordsmithing of it in terms of how you look at things. I do know, and we'll get into this later, that there's one specific comment from a Greenfield property owner that wants to have mix not applied to their property. And I've come out and indicated I don't think that's appropriate. I think that mix is always important on large vacant residential lands.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on to Councillor Smith.
Pass.
Okay. Your worship,
Yes.
Mayor Judy Brown, go ahead.
Alrighty, so, you know that the report speaks of a recreation facility. And one of the things, the challenges that council has had to come up with is, as far as having the money to afford it, is the arterial road, which is my question. If the, town grows according to the county projections, I think we could use another north-south artery. So I just wondered if you had any comment on that. Do you see that being a problem, that we simply can't afford to build the arterial road?
I think being able to afford growth is a critical aspect that the communities have to look at. I think having development charges in place that are current and reflect the elements of growth that need future investment is really important. I don't think that it's my place or necessarily the role of the official plan to get into individual components. And I will publicly declare a personal conflict of interest with respect to the arterial road, in that I live in downtown Glen Tay. And I have, on any given weekday basis, 40 of your transport trucks go through past my front door. And Glen Tay is the bypass to get, for transport trucks to get to the south half of Perth.
Yeah.
I have very, very clear and precise opinions on that matter, but they are personal.
Okay, I understand, but that's a good point about being able to afford growth. Second question, well, it's more of a comment. I like how strongly you have come out in favor of community gardens and backyard agriculture and agriculture in general. The last time we broached possibly having chickens in your backyard, there were some people that thought it was the end of the world, but we have no food security and we need to provide for that situation. That wasn't a question.
Do you have a third one?
I do, if I could read my writing. Land compatibility. But I don't remember what my point was, so I'll pass.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bolt.
No further question.
Okay. Councillor McPherson.
Just some comments. Forbes, I really like your plan. And I didn't like our last official plan. It was way too wordy, way too many motherhood statements that kept being repeated in the plan that we were never going to accomplish. And I like how you're more succinct and you said it earlier, you know, you've identified it. I'd like to see the plan with the top 5 things that we could realistically accomplish based on the amount of staff we have and the challenges facing the town of Perth. Council knows that you have your official plan, and you also have your 4 or 5 year walking papers to the staff of the strategic plan, and how are those two going to work together with the official plan? And then you tie that into the provincial government's changing everything. Every time you turn the TV set on, there's a new idea coming out of Toronto that we should all follow that really doesn't work for most of us. And finally, it's affordability to me. And I'm really concerned about the downloading of things that are happening to small or every municipality in the province right now, and especially social housing. There's no way in the world the town of Perth can afford to be in the business of social housing. Everybody knows that. It was front and center at our recent Roma conference. There's a really good article from Enid Slade. I was talking to Michael about it today in one of the recent Municipal World magazines. And she's talking about that we need to stay in our lane, that the town has to realize there's only so many things we can do on our limited tax base, and to make promises to people or give the public the impression that we're open to a lot of different ideas that we're really not able to afford, unless you expect the taxpayers to really have their tax increases go up. I think that has to form one of the founding policies in the official plan. I'm not really sure I understand the zoning bylaw. I think Joanne, you said we're probably due for an updated zoning bylaw, and I've read a lot about that lately from other municipalities. So I appreciate our official plan. I'd just like to make sure our official plan is something that realistically in the next 5 to 10 years is something the town of Perth can live with and can achieve. As I said, there were a lot of issues I had with the previous one, allocation of parking spaces, where parking should be, things like that we didn't necessarily follow. But anyway, I like your plan, how it's much shorter, but I would like to see that of the many things that you've listed, the top 5 that really need to be addressed, and what can be addressed in a small town. The question of even the fairgrounds, I've had some conversations with people who've sat on the fair board and things like that, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's a topic we're probably going to be successful with down the road. But anyway, I appreciate the work so far you've done it, and especially a lot of the comments people have made.
Anything further? Okay.
Just
Could I ask?
quickly respond to that? I think, council, that we need to reflect that this is not going to be a new official plan. This is going to be an update of your existing one. And I agree with you that there's elements of this official plan that are very wordy, prescriptive, and going beyond what I think an effective official plan should be. I think that council should think of this as the last time you update your official plan. The next time you hit your 5-year cycle, I think you should be looking at a brand new official plan with community visioning, community missions, and that you start from the ground floor and you create, I think, the type of document you're talking about, Councillor, that it's forward thinking, it's aspirational, it's clear, it's concise, and it's achievable. I think there are elements where things are repeated so many times in the official plan on the same topic that it creates a landmine for planners and council and developers, right?
Mhm.
You read one thing in one spot and then it says something slightly different in the other spot. And that, I think this document has served the town very, very well. But I also think that this is the last time you should think about tweaking it. And the next time you should think about replacing it. And I'm not saying that as a consultant. I'm saying that as someone that's used the document as your planner historically, had the privilege to do that, and a critical, honest opinion. In terms of affordability, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think that as staff and council, we have to really challenge the development industry on this whole area of affordability. I think that developers come to the table with a preconceived product. They've got it in the can. And I don't think that that's good enough anymore. I don't know where the rule is or when we decided that every dwelling needed to have a parking garage in it. I had a developer come forward the other day and was really excited. He had a new product that was coming to the market and it was going to be between the 575 and 650,000. And he kept using the word affordability. And I was having a hard time putting 650,000 and affordable in the same sentence. But I said to him, I said, listen, that's lovely, looks beautiful. I said, what if I could knock 100,000 off of that product? He says, it's impossible. I just took the pen and stroked out the attached garage. It was a 2-car garage. Structurally, the investment was a 1/6 of the value of house. Why can't we build houses now without an attached garage so that when they get down the road and they could afford maybe having a detached garage on the property? Why do we have to have that with every single house that comes along? I think we need to be more creative when it comes to apartment buildings. I am personally involved in a project in Arnprior right now where my client is building 4-story buildings and 10% of the units are going to be affordable under CMHC and as a 1-bedroom apartment coming to market at $1,214 a month, right? He's not allowed to pick and choose who gets those affordable units, right? What we're encouraging is that the county comes along, becomes the leasee, takes over the units, and then they can pick and choose who goes into those units based on their needs list, right? There's a lot of creativity out there in the private sector and through federal programs and provincial programs and how to achieve affordability. We just need to be open to them. We need to be creative and we need to think about it, right? It is possible to do, right? It's just that we have to break the ceiling or the box that we've put ourselves in historically. Again, I would like to think about your policies being more progressive in terms of affordability, because I agree with you that it's the number one planning issue we have to address head on. Thank you.
I have a few questions, if I may ask. I'm wondering where and if you see, as we move forward with developments, demolition might come into the official plan. Because especially for infills or when we have abandoned buildings, those types of things. Has there been thought given to that? And I'll let you go ahead with that first.
Thank you. So certainly demolition comes into play in terms of heritage properties and heritage designations, and you have policies related to that. And I think that, again, those are the types of policies that I believe got tweaked through some of the legislation, and we need to make sure they're current. In other non-heritage areas, my experience is that official plans don't typically get into demolition. There will be policies in your affordable housing section that says retaining existing building stock is an important means of addressing affordable housing. So it's demolition. It's addressing demolition, but sort of backdoor. When you get into infill and intensification, certainly in a community like Perth where there's not a lot of vacant lots, demolition becomes part of that. You do have quite a large housing stock that's from the 30s and 40s and 50s that were purpose built as wartime housing that may be coming to the end of their life cycle to start with, and demolition is a viable option. Typically, official plans don't get too far into that. It's more operational, more building code.
Okay, so I received a lot of emails before this meeting because I'm chairing it, and I heard things like engineers report required before evictions if stating deemed unsafe. Hamilton, for example, to become the first on in Ontario with a bylaw to stop bad faith renovictions. And another one common theme was common area agreements, basically input surrounding neighbors. Are these are not part of the official plan? Are you telling me that these are part of policies?
I think that you would need to be careful about going down this road.
Okay,
I do know that through zoning amendments, which typically involve infill and intensification, and I can think of one at Beckwith and Brock that a number of councillors were involved with, where there was an older building that was removed and a relatively attractive new building put back in place that doubled the density and doubled the number of units and is used as an example of positive neighborhood change. That had neighborhood engagement through the zoning process, right? I think if you have neighborhood engagement outside of the Planning Act and the prescribed, I think you've got to be really careful about that, because my experience is that you can have this expectation that they can influence change when really at the end of the day, there's not a lot of ability to influence change if it's not required under the Planning Act. Again, I also think that we have to be careful of taking examples from large urban areas and how they may have systemic problems that we don't necessarily have in our small town. It's not to say that we shouldn't anticipate some of those, but I think that renoviction types of situations, it's certainly not as common.
okay.
And it may not be worthy of policy, and I would be hard pressed to figure out how you would craft a policy.
Okay, and then under 14, emergency management, the emergency management would then also include things like evacuation, would that, and as well wildland fires, and sites where people could go for protection. Maybe we want to talk to the conversations that you had with our fire chief at this time.
No, so absolutely. So I think that your official plan needs to talk about a community being prepared for emergencies. I think that wildland fires is a provincial requirement that we plan for that. Typically, it's not a problem for urban areas. The other thing that I think when we speak about emergency management in the official plan is we talk in general terms, in terms of preparedness, having a plan, coordinating with neighboring municipalities, but the operational component of your emergency plan would not be vetted and talked about here, but it would be left to the emergency plan, and because that's an operational document. Policy should speak about operational documents in a general sense, but not be prescriptive in terms of what those documents say. And I think that the town has a very good emergency management plan. Evacuation centers are planned for and talked about and known about, and we have them. And you do an annual exercise to work at that. But the official plan policies, I think, would be more general in nature and point towards the operational documents.
And the last question I have, and I'm not sure if this falls under transportation or housing, and intensification. So I hear this over and over and over again. The need for provisions, to transportation routes going in and out and the impact they would have on surrounding neighborhoods and the networks of roads during a building process that could potentially go on for years. And things like how are we going to channel the traffic, the times of the day that traffic is going up and down the streets, the loads, the weights on the roads and those types of things. Can you comment on that?
I'd be happy to. Thank you very much, Chair. This is, again, we did receive comments from the public. Mr. Tennant was quite eloquent in his thoughts on that. I did take the opportunity on this specific element, Chair, to speak to one of my colleagues, one of the senior planners in our firm, who was a planner for the city of Toronto and worked for a private developer in the GTA on this, because I'm not aware of any official plan policies that I've ever been exposed to in rural small town Ontario that's talked about construction management plans, right? And so I spoke to my colleague, Anthony Holmick, about that in particular, and whether he was aware in the GTA if they had official plan policies to that extent. And he said, no, they did not. That typically construction traffic and hours of operation and routes are detailed on a case-by-case basis and are typically reflected in subdivision agreements or site plan agreements. And that it's through those more detailed site-specific plans that you vet and speak about. So where are the dump trucks coming? Where are the cement trucks coming? How are they getting here? When are they going to be on the streets? Hours of operation, truck routes. Anthony did suggest, and this is something I would like to add in, is that there is now a component of most official plans that talks about what a complete development application looks like. You know, you've got traffic studies and lot grading and stormwater management and other types of studies, archaeological. He said that it is now common for construction management plans to be a component of a complete application, so that when there is a public debate before council, or there is a review of a site plan by staff, that the flow of traffic, the hours of operation, the storage of material, the stockpiling, different things like that get vetted and talked about in a plan, so that you're forcing the developer to think about this up front, as opposed to a reactionary afterthought from neighborhoods going, what do you mean I'm going to have 50 dump trucks a day? So I think that originally my comments to Mr. Tennant may have been a wee bit dismissive and saying, no, it's outside of an official plan. But again, Mr. Tennant has a tendency to give me pause and force me to think, and I have, and I think that there's a way that we can address the nugget of thought that he has, that we need to think about this in our planning approval process.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm just looking at our time, and actually we're right on time as to what I was anticipating. I was hoping to have everyone out of here by 4. That's my goal. But I certainly, by no shape or form, want to leave any information unturned. So we'll go to our third section, which is the last section, includes, and we've already touched on some of this, so I suspect we'll get through this very quickly. that all the comments that were received in writing from community members, stakeholders and groups, and that starts at the very top with the Ministry of Transportation right down to the final document, very descriptive document and information from the table, and a lot of thought put into that. So if you want to just touch on any of that,
Excuse me,
Laura?
Madam Chair,
yes,
could we have a small break?
absolutely, we can. Would you like to make a motion to have a break?
Yes, I move that we have a 10-minute break at this time.
Okay, all in favor? Nope. All, anyone against? Okay, so one against and the rest in favor, so that carries. We'll take a 5-minute break. You want 10 minutes? 10-minute break, okay. We're going to reconvene. Thank you very much. So I've already given the introduction to the third section, and Forbes has already talked to number 18, which was the MTO. He's also addressed number 19, Leeds and Grenville Lanark District Health Unit, and as well Jack Tannett's concerns have been brought forward. So I think if we move forward from 20.2 right to 20.12, which will take us to the table in the next 15 minutes or less. And then we'll go with questions again, and then we will wrap it up with next steps. Okay, so go take it away.
Thanks very much, Chair. One of the things I always somewhat reluctant to get involved with is critiquing thoughtful public comments in a public document in a whole lot of detail. And originally, I more or less had them in this document and said, Council, you tell me what you want to do. When I reviewed the draft with staff, they said, you know, maybe a little bit more direction on the comments would be helpful. What I would like to do is encourage council to look at Appendix D of the report, where I have the individual comments, and in red at the end of each comment, I've put some general annotations. I want you to realize these are my comments, and they are not meant to handcuff council. If you disagree with my comments, I am completely open to that. For your reference, NC means no change, right? Where I've agreed with them, I've tended to open up my annotation with agree. And there are going to be comments where you see no change to policies on golf course lands and things of that nature. The other thing throughout, you're going to see no change. It's an operational matter, no change. It's a zoning matter. And so I've gone through those. And with respect to Mr. Tennant's comments, I think the first page, there's a couple of points I agree with him on that are tweaking and reference points. We did speak earlier about the top of his second page, chapter 5, page 7, where I said construction traffic's not a policy typically dealt with on a case-by-case in development agreements. I would like to append that by saying we can, under complete application, make a construction management plan requirement. I'm not sure if there's too much more. He did ask that Carolina Village, which is the area over Peter Street, Rogers Road, North Street. I think historically in the town plot that was referred to as Carolina Village. I think it was discussed, council, when there was Stefano did the apartment building on Rogers Road, close to Peter Street. It came up at that time. Again, I don't think it's a big deal that it be included. It's certainly not going to hurt.
Sorry, what page are you in the overall pagination?
I think it's gone beyond pages, council. or Mayor, I think I'm on page 89. I've moved beyond the table
Mhm.
to the individual annotations
Three,
in the
yeah.
appendix B.
Print those on.
Is there anything with respect to Mr. Tennant's comments and my response to him that you would like me to rethink?
Any
And-
questions in
Yeah.
regards to that?
The other thing is I want to again say, this isn't a final determination. If on looking at this and thinking about it, it's like, no, I think I'd like to see X, Y, and Z. Let me know. We're at a point where we can be very accommodating if you wish me to review and debate those issues. If not, I'm going to go to Mr. Wright's, Mr. and Mrs. Wright's comments. And as you know, they have the sale barn property, the former McLean's livestock sale property. They've asked that they be allowed to have just sort of a single detached development neighborhood. I think I've made it very clear to council that I think that all these greenfield lands should be subject to mixed densities. He's also referenced lands over on Brock Street. And that I'm aware that there's development constraints and that it's close to industry and they need to do the studies and the plans and work through the planning approval process. And I don't think there's much in this process that we can help them out with, but I do want to stress that I think all large greenfield lands should have a mix. And then it's up to council when you're presented individual development proposals to manage that and deal with the site specific.
Developer, and that was a sticking point. They absolutely refused.
And the one-
Excuse me if I may interject. Could you speak into your mic, please? Thank you.
The developer absolutely refused to do mixed housing. So,
one of the things that I think council needs to adopt is that developers come in and they're responsible for the development of their specific property. You're responsible for the development of the community. And not all development proposals match with the growth and the development of a community. If someone comes in with a property and said, it's this way or the highway, you tell them to have a nice ride. And I think that you have so little greenfield lands. And you're such an attractive community that you can't just roll over the first time a developer says, I'm only doing this, despite what your official plan says. And I think you have to stand up for the basic planning principles that on this property, it's of a size and a nature that it would be a complete waste of everybody's time and resources that it only be developed as single detached houses. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to say no, but I think that if you have policies that are clear and concise, it helps. The Friends of the Tay gave quite a lengthy comment. There's a couple of areas that I agree with them on. I think generally the request was to be more specific and more detailed in the policies. And I take a different approach. I think sometimes more general statements in an official plan are appropriate. Certainly in the introduction part of the plan, there's other areas where, you know, the specifics get addressed elsewhere in the plan. I don't think it needs to be as detailed and as specific as being suggested here. I think that there some of the suggestions, particularly about 5.3, the Tay River Watershed Management Plan. I think we can make reference to plans that are approved and developed and have a certain amount of status, but I don't think we should be talking about aspirational documents or documents that are in process. I don't think that that's appropriate policy. I think some of the references to the Tay Canal and the Turning Bridge, those are specific mentions that he's got throughout the document. I don't think that there's necessarily a problem with some of them. I think others, are very repetitive and not necessary. I think tree canopy targets are a really hard thing to do. Tree canopy targets, he's asked for specific tree canopy targets. I think it's arbitrary picking 25%. I think in an urban context, tree canopy targets are extremely challenging, and typically have been used to stop the cutting of trees on greenfield development. And I can stand before you and tell you, if you're doing urban density development, any trees on that property are coming down unless they're boundary trees. Trees can be planted, right? There are other issues that are important. Not saying trees aren't, but in an urban context, they need to be specifically located in specific areas. And a broad target, I think, is not appropriate. The United Church, I think their comments in general are supportive of existing policy, tweaking of existing policies. I think some of them, again, are the specifics in a general policy, which I'm not supportive of. Again, if council feels that you would like me to consider that, I have no problem. Some of them I think are appropriate. Some of the nuanced wording is appropriate, but for the most part, I think it's asking for too much detailed wording in general policies. There are some areas in the place of worship section that I think we agreed to, and other Planning Act references. I don't have a problem with them. Emma Simard made some comments specifically related to commuter transportation and commuter travel. Again, that's more of an operational issue. I think we can talk in general sense in policy, and I think you already do. But again, that's more of an operational matter and a hard one. How do you get OC transport out to the town of Perth, right? They're hard pressed to have it go out to Osgood and Manotick within the city boundaries. It's
Maybe a light rail system.
maybe a light rail system. They're very affordable, I hear. But again, it isn't a laughing matter. I think it's appropriate for the town to work with private sector to look at ways of achieving this, that if there's a business case for a bus or other types of private sector components, you should support that and encourage that, and park and rides and those things. But you have policies already that are aspirational in that nature. There were, comments from Kate Donnelly, essentially dealing with trees and promoting the program, coming out of the Perth Climate Action Panel. I think that those are great. Again, more operational in nature. We could be updating some of the streetscaping components to speak specifically to that and at least maybe tighten up the wording or clear statements on that, but there wasn't a lot there for me to sink my teeth in. The next one was from Danica Benito. Again, more about active transportation. I think active transportation policies are to be enhanced. I think having an active transportation component on one of your schedules is really strong. You're blessed with regional trail networks, and those should be promoted. The next comment was from Bob Henry, specific to the golf course lands, and I don't think that we need to belabor that. Carolyn Franklin, again, comments about active Perth, dealing with climate change, and I think we've spoke about updating the plan with respect to climate change. Pedestrian and active transportation policies are to be enhanced. Intensification policies are to be enhanced. One of the interesting things is people are quite often challenging small town parking standards. And they typically use large urban examples where there is public transit. Until such day as we get to the size of a Peterborough or a Kingston and we can afford to have a public transit system, we have to deal with the reality that we're a rural small town community with pickup trucks and SUVs. And that's what we have. And we have to plan for parking those. And so it really, again, this is a situation where they talk about workable or walkable communities. Absolutely. But we're a regional service center and we want to bring people into our downtown core. And they're not all going to be able to walk or ride their bike here, and we have to plan for that. Number of comments that I've agreed on, active transportation components. Number of the comments were operational or related to existing policy. Housing policies, I think, are going to be enhanced. Mr. Hendricks, Tony Hendricks, gave very thoughtful comments, particularly related to climate change, and I think the policies that we've discussed would be enhanced. John McKenty spoke about statements in the plan to have a continued strategic place for the BIA, and I don't think there's any intent to, certainly not on my behalf, to change any policies, existing policies related to the BIA. The table gave one of the more comprehensive public comments I've ever received on the official plan update. And I think that they were extremely all-encompassing. But quite a few of the comments related to zoning, quite a few of them related to other bylaws of the town, quite a few of them related to operational issues and outside of the policies. You had very thoughtful comments on Indigenous recognition and food sovereignty. I think I'm hopeful that the policies are going to be respectful of the suggestions by Chief Lalonde with respect to Indigenous consultation. Food sovereignty is a difficult policy to deal with in an official plan. It's more of a social policy than it is a land use policy. Of course, you need land to grow food, but food sovereignty is a social planning concept. We can make aspirational statements. We can provide for opportunities to grow food in one's backyard, on community gardens, but it really is difficult to get into food sovereignty in a big way. The other elements they've talked about are things like not allowing fast food close to schools. I don't know how you write that kind of policy. I think that it becomes it's a challenging area to get into. Again, if council wishes, I will take a stab at that, but I think that we have to be careful about that. I think a lot of the times dealing with these things, they're more operational and less policy, but I'm sure Ramsey would challenge me on that. And I respect him very much, and anyway, their idea about parks and open space and allowing a range of permitted uses to include agricultural activities. I have no problems with that. City of Ottawa has some of the best policies in the country on urban agriculture. I personally believe that people should have 3 or 4 hens in their backyard for their own eggs and entertainment. But I also respect that it's a hard thing to deal with. But it's not so much an official plan policy, again, as an operational thing. There's ways to do it and do it well and do it right and not have negative impact. And everybody knows that there's chickens being raised in backyards in Perth now without any harm or foul.
By a rooster.
Whoa.
Okay.
There's not too much more on page 5 of Ramsey's or the tables that I'd like to speak on. I think we've talked about urban agriculture. Some of the idea about designating prime agricultural land. There is no prime agricultural land in the town of Perth. There is some class 4 lands, but they're not prime agricultural as would be defined in the provincial policy statement. We've talked about densities. I think we can have aspirational policies regarding urban agriculture. Stormwater policies, I think, again, are going to be looked at, certainly to be resilient to climate change. I do not believe the Daru farm qualifies as agriculture. And I don't think that in a community like Perth, it would be appropriate to have agriculture in the urban boundary. One of the things about agriculture and the minimum distance separation policies from the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs is that livestock facilities do not get calculated in an urban environment with a minimum distance separation. So typically, you don't have livestock facilities in urban areas. There's many small hamlets that have barns in them, and we deal with those somewhat effectively. But in a community like Perth, I think that you would want to be careful about things like livestock facilities and certainly abattoirs that bring livestock into the community. They're dealt with and regulated at a provincial level. And there's a reason that there's not new abattoirs popping up. They're extremely challenging land use to deal with, both from a transportation, livestock, and waste management standpoint. And I would caution council to look at the Daru farm as being appropriate for that. There is lots of good agricultural lands around Perth in the rural municipalities where that is part of their business. And that's where that type of land use, I think, should be encouraged. Suggestions that in your business park and industrial designations, you include food storage, food warehousing, and distribution as permitted uses. I have no problem with that, but I would suggest to you that the general wording of your plan now would not prohibit those uses from coming in, but making the specific reference in this case may be seen as being more permissive and allowing and encouraging, and not a bad idea. He talked about bonusing, and I think that this is one point that's important for council to appreciate. Bill 23, I think it was Bill 23, it could have been Bill 109. There were quite a few bills in the last few years. Removed bonusing from a policy permitted under the Planning Act. So municipalities no longer can have policies that encourage height and density in return for enhanced environmental protection or affordable housing or heritage preservation, which was one of the main deliverables in the Perth plan for increased height and density. We just can't do that anymore. And so that's one suggestion that is now outside of the Planning Act. One of the things we mentioned is this idea of not having fast food or convenience near schools. Again, I think it challenges the general premise of free market, and is getting into some social engineering. However, if council wishes me to take a stab at that, I could, but I'd be careful going down that hole. It would be a challenging policy to implement. You might be able to write it, but I think it would be a heck of a hard thing to stop. And really, when you get into zoning, there's not a whole lot of difference from a zoning bylaw standpoint between the bistro or McDonald's, right? They're both restaurants, right? And so it would be a challenge, I would think. But again, if you wish me to take a stab at that, I can do some research and see if others are dealing with it. I think the idea of putting in a definition of food security and food sovereignty, I don't think that there would be any harm in doing that. I think that it's worthy of a mention, but in terms of detailed policy related to land use, I think it would be more aspirational in nature. I do believe that that's the
Pretty
end
well it.
of it.
Okay, so to wind this up, and get on with the next steps, are there any questions? Okay, go ahead, Councillor Bird.
Thank you, Chair. Is that in general about today, or is it specific to what's just been said?
Specific about what has just been said.
Oh, thank
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, Council Waterford.
Through you, Chair, to Forbes. Forbes, this is related to what you've just shared with us. We have an active transportation plan and an economic development plan that will be presented to this council in the near future. Could you make a general comment about the relationship of those two documents to an official plan?
So I think that as a minimum, the official plan should recognize important strategic documents that have an approval standing before council. Your transportation plans, things of that nature. I think that they should be certainly acknowledged. And like your recreation plan, it would be worthy of my time and effort to mine them to see if there's specific land use policies that are being recommended. If nothing else, the cross-reference to the plans would have that happen. But I think, you know, going through the recreation master plan, which I did both for Tay Valley, Lanark Highlands and Drummond when I did their update, was I found to be a very worthwhile exercise and certainly enhanced the policies. And I would think the active transportation plan and the mapping that comes out of that, bringing that into the official plan in terms of a planning emphasis, I think is a great idea.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
One more question, Madam Chair, through you to Forbes. There was mention in the table's recommendation with regards to urban agriculture in front yards. I would appreciate your comment on that specifically. What is the trend in other municipalities and your general thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm a proponent of urban agriculture. I'm a proponent of growing food. I'm a proponent of cooking food and not processed food. I think that we should be encouraging that and not restricting that. I think having general aspirational policies in the plan is a good idea, but essentially it comes down to your yards bylaw and property standards. And some people really like Kentucky bluegrass in the front yard. Other people like tomatoes and squash. And I think in this day and age, certain tolerance in our bylaws to accommodate individual wishes like that should be attempted. And so I don't think that really official plans get into whether front yard should be parking or should be grass or should be tomatoes. I think that's more into detailed site specific bylaws or yard bylaws or property standard bylaws or even the zoning bylaw to a certain extent. But I think the policy at the policy level, you talk about generally supportive of growing food. That's my personal sort of take on it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes,
Your worship?
Perth itself is not an agricultural community. It is and has been for a while the service center for the agriculture around it. So we ran into a situation last year or the year before where a fellow wanted to set up his a fruit and vegetable stand. But because of the way our bylaws were written, he had to be treated as if the regulations that were applied were as if he wanted to like build a house there. Is there any way we can encompass somebody that wants, excuse me, to do something like that without having to go through all sorts of extra hoops?
I think, Mayor, the key word that you used was regulation, right? I don't think it would be your official plan that would be a barrier to them. It's how you deal with roadside stands and commercial activity without a building, right? And so I think that it comes down to how your regulations deal with that type of thing and less about policy. I think policy on that is more general in nature, that they can't create traffic hazards, right? There needs to be appropriate parking. They're typically located on commercial properties, but in a general sense. But the details of the how and the hoops that you have to go through are in the regulation. And that's where time and effort needs to be taken to make sure the regulations have barriers where they're appropriate and are permissive and supportive where they are appropriate.
Thank you. Any further questions? I don't have any. I think you've really covered off well on all three sections of the document. Moving forward, we need to talk about next steps. I think as a council, we're eager to see this document go before county and have its blessings, but I understand there's a progression and a number of steps that we have to go through. Would you just like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so my hope is that this document is a springboard into the next section. I would like, after council gives whatever deliberation you think you need, that there would be a motion accepting or revising or altering whatever direction I've recommended to proceed. And that motion receives the report and gives direction to me to proceed with drafting the official plan amendment and the detailed policies that then would come before you to be vetted and debated. I would be hopeful that I would be able to meet the original timelines. Once you've given me direction, I think it's 4 months to have something back to you in a draft form. Once it's in a draft form, typically what I do is I ask that you endorse it for the purposes of public review. And then we go out to the public, we send it to the government agencies. There's still all kinds of time for wordsmithing, right? You don't have to be 100% happy with it, though that's would be nice. But you don't have to be 100% happy, but you need to know that it's good enough to go out for public vetting. And then once we get all the public comments, there will be a detailed report critiquing all of those comments, including individual counselors that I encourage you to provide comments on that document. And then we have a final go around. Usually there's motions involved and certain recommendations where there's disagreement or debate amongst council. And we finalize it, you adopt it, and it goes to county for approval. There is no appeal of your decision, but there would be an appeal option for the county approval. So the appeals happen once it's adopted by the county, if there are going to be any challenges. So please review and give thoughtful consideration for this report. Give me clear direction on jumping into the policy. I will draft up the policy based on sort of the general table of content that we've talked about today and subject matters. And I will stay to that. And then we'll debate the details.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say then, Forbes, is we need a motion to receive this this issues and options report. And you have provided us direction and suggestions for various areas of this actual report. And you are needing a blessing from council to proceed. That this is only, this is a draft. This is not,
We're not approving anything
no. Today, we're just basically receiving the information
and giving direction for me to go to the next stage.
and direction to proceed.
Yes,
Okay.
you're absolutely correct, Chair.
You have something to say, Councillor Bard?
Yes, directly to where we are right now, if I may, Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair. He's not currently here, but you and the deputy mayor earlier had a conversation about wordsmithing and clarity.
Yes, sir.
And I am concerned that we've missed or might be missing an opportunity here. You, in that part of that, you referenced how there was perhaps a contradiction that you'd noticed in some of the parts of the plan, official plan.
Yes.
And your recommendation really was that 5 years or so down the road that we completely redo it. I'm worrying that we're missing an opportunity. I'm making an assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, that anything that you would be putting in new, and I'm thinking like the indigenous sections of it, would be in plain speak.
I would hope so, sir.
Yes, I think that was where the deputy mayor was going. Are we missing an opportunity, or is this an opportunity now to introduce a bit more plain speak and remove? We were trying to do this in other bylaws in the town, remove redundancies and contradictions.
You want to
Uh,
respond to that?
Yeah. I think, Counselor, that what I have before you are the areas where you need to have new policy and change. With council's direction, as I'm going through and creating the red line official plan, which will be your official plan that will show you cut and replace. I would like to think that I could work with staff and identify where there's duplication, redundancy, extremely wordy sections. And we would take that opportunity to tighten some of that up as well. It's hard when you're just doing a quick, not a quick review, but when you're doing the basic review, to pick up all of those components and start articulating them. But when I'm going in and actually writing in new sections and cutting out other sections in that red line document, it's easier to do it then. And I would certainly hope we take the opportunity to remove any conflict. There are some structural redundancies that will be challenging, but I'm very, very open to suggestion to overall improve the document.
The deputy mayor and I have raised it. I would like, if we could, Chair, if that's the direction we want to go in council, it would be consistent with what we're trying to do in other bylaws and the work that the club.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is, along with the motion, to include in that, our consultant will proceed and work with the staff in the overall improvement of, the wording. Would that encompass what you're saying?
And I know it's not perfect, as you suggested. It's as they strike you. Correct.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that general wording, Madam Chair, and this conversation is sufficient for me to understand council's intent, if that's a position supported by council, for sure.
Of course. Go ahead, Council Waterfield.
Through you, Madam Chair, to Forbes. On page 49, you make reference to the fact that there is currently a draft of the new provincial policy statement. And our official plan has to adhere to the provincial policy statement, where the two processes I'm interpreting are kind of happening concurrently. So as we proceed with our process, I'm worried about timing, and my nightmare scenario is that we finally get our official plan approved, then the brand new provincial policy statement comes out and there's a conflict there. Have you seen the current draft? Are we sort of in sync? I'd appreciate some comments on that. I think it's very important.
Thank you very much. That is a bit of a wild card that all communities are facing right now. There was a draft of a new provincial policy statement released this time last year. And I would like to suggest to council that it was under a different social context at the provincial level. It was done at a time when the province was unilaterally changing local official plans, unilaterally expanding urban boundaries, unilaterally removing lands from a protection status. And that version of the PPS that was being circulated and debated and was on the Environmental Bill of Rights for comment reflected that sort of approach. It was essentially letting go of the reins. And it was certainly pro-development. And it was done in an effort to accelerate housing starts. That social context, I believe, has changed at the provincial level. I think that there's been a number of decisions that started last September that reversed a number of the initiatives by the province. There's certainly been minister zoning orders that have been reversed. There's been urban boundary expansions that have been reversed. And to the best of my knowledge, there's been very little debate about the draft provincial policy statement over the last 6 months. I am working for a municipality in Peterborough County, and Peterborough County has had an adopted official plan sitting at the province waiting approval for the last 10 months.
Wow.
And it's basically been on hold until the province decides what they want to do with the PPS. They're sort of keenly aware. I think there's a potential that we would see some form of a new PPS over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. My advice to my clients is not to change course. Stick with it, get the job done. If the change happens mid-course, I think that there's enough flexibility in your budget and the process to accommodate any of those changes as they come along. If the policies change after adoption, there's an opportunity to work with Lanark County approval process to do friendly modifications to that adopted document. If it happens after Lanark County approval, then you're just going to be in the same position you are right now with an approved PPS and your local official plan slightly out of sync. And if the changes are minor, you can have an amendment to the plan to tweak them. If the changes are significant, you may look at other strategies. But I would not change course, but you should know that I am keenly aware of those policy potentials and monitoring it as vigorously as I can. And if something happens mid-course, we will have a discussion about it.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Joanna. We would like to hear what you have to say.
I'm gonna throw a big loop into this with a clarification, if I could. You were talking about Ed wanting clarifications in a 5-year update. I think, quite frankly, it is time for for a total redo, but based on budget, we went ahead and just did an update instead of a redo. Seeking clarification as to whether or not council does want a full update. Because if that's the case, like, there would be some financial cost and additional time, which I can't speak to right now, but it seems like two of you are looking for a complete redo, which I'm not opposed to, but we went this direction based on financial, what had been set aside.
So that brings up another another topic, and I think we'll I think I'll go back to Councillor Waterfield. What are you feeling about in regards to the comment that was just made by Joanna?
I feel that with the budget that we've put forward, that having an update of the plan at this point in time is appropriate. I would be opposed to just doing an update in 5 years. I think that 5 years down the road, we need to do a complete redo. But I think the financial reality and also the human resources reality at this point in time does not make it realistic to do a complete review.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure, I'd like council to know that your budget is a reasonable amount of money for me to be flexible and accommodating with council's wishes. And I will work to that budget and I will try to get as much done as humanly possible. I'm relatively efficient with this business at this stage in my life. And I think we can accommodate a lot. It won't be a new plan, right? But I think that we can accommodate some of the aspirations that Councillor Byrd spoke of and Ed as well.
Okay. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Just
Your
thinking,
worship.
I read in the newspaper or wherever online that the federal government plans on bringing in 1 million immigrants in the next short period of time. I'm just wondering if that's something that we should acknowledge in the official plan, because it could have quite an effect on the type of people that come to buy houses here, for example.
I think that my general planning approach, plan to policy, is to not get into ethnicity or things of that nature, but to talk about people in a very general sense. I would think I do know that there are a number of communities that have operational plans on dealing with integrating new Canadians into their community. I can take a look, Mayor, to see if there's some policy that we could speak to in a sort of an aspirational sense. I think really at the end of the day, it comes down to affordability, housing mix, and diversity of tenure and ownership. And it doesn't matter whether you're new to Canada or you're fifth generation Canada. Those are realities that all of us are dealing with. And housing, I think, is the #1 building block of a community.
Wouldn't be necessarily to acknowledge that ethnicity, but rather just that many people are coming in and we need to provide for them.
Yeah, and I think we can maybe touch on Perth being a welcoming community to new residents. I think that that type of aspirational work, and it's there to a certain extent already, but maybe putting an exclamation mark on it wouldn't hurt. Absolutely.
Okay, I think that we should wrap this up. I think that every counselor has had an incredible opportunity to ask questions on the various sections of the document. I have to say, you're an incredible resource to our council, and thank you so much for being our spokesperson today. And also your comment about allowing flexibility and to look into a variety of different areas that have been brought forward. What needs to happen right now is we need a motion to receive. Do you have one, or is it okay? Okay. Yeah, we need a mover for the motion. Thank you, Councillor Bolt. Pardon? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Susan.
Through the chair, as recommended by the committee of the whole, be it resolved that the council of the town of Perth receive for information the preliminary planning issues and policy options report by JP2G Consulting, Inc., dated March 4th, 2024, and presented by Forbes Simon. And further, that Mr. Simon be directed to proceed with drafting the official plan amendment and related policies, including working with town staff to improve concise and plain language wording in the official plan, to be brought forward to council for consideration and future public consultation.
All in favor? That's unanimous. That carries. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I do want you and council to know that it's an honor to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next meeting, the regular committee of the whole, is Tuesday, April the 2nd, 2024 at 5:30, and Councillor Barry Smith will be chairing. Are there any questions from the media? Not being any, we are ready to adjourn. I need this moved by Councillor Dave Bird.
Thank you, Chair. That the special committee of the whole meeting held on March the 12th, 2024, adjourn at 3:52 PM.
How about that? We're under the wire, 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for your participation. And again, thank you for your consultation.